Hello and welcome to the 2021 Bad Sydney Crime Writers Festival. We're almost at the end of 4 days. Who's been here for a day other than today? And other sessions today? Terrific. But I'm on the board. My name's Suzanne Leal, so I may be biased, but it seems to me that there's been a lot of goodwill and that the sessions have been really interesting. And I think more than anything, people are delighted to be out and about and rubbing shoulders again with readers and writers. So welcome here, and it's lovely to have you. For those who don't know me, I'm the author of 3 novels, most recently The Deceptions and The Teacher's Secret. And I'm so delighted to be here with Barry Maitland, Anna Downs, who's beside me, and Wendy James, who's on the other side of the room. And our session is What Lies Below the Surface, which gives us an awful lot to talk about at a Crime Writers Festival. We are, of course, on Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. I have, of course, some housekeeping notes, which you'll be well used to. We're following COVID protocols. Everybody's double vaxxed here. We've all checked in with our QR code and are wearing masks except for eating and drinking and when we're on stage. Social distancing means that there are restricted numbers in the room. We've also got people joining us on Zoom, and I'd like to welcome them, both people who have come in themselves, but also who are watching at their local library or at home through their local library. You've seen that there's hand sanitizer sand sanitizer at the door, and if you're feeling unwell, please let a volunteer know. You've got your mobile phones and they're muted, but they're a wonderful tool, particularly for social media. So please don't hesitate to tweet or go on Instagram or Facebook. And if you could use the tags @BadCrimeSydney or #BadCrimeSydney. We're going to have time for questions at the end of the session, both for everybody in the room and also on Zoom. So if you are on Zoom, just pop some questions either in the chat function or the Q&A function. But now to my guests. Let me introduce you. Anna Downs was born and raised in the UK, but she now lives on the central coast of New South Wales. So that's good enough for us to all claim her as ours. She trained as an actor, appearing in BBC shows including EastEnders, Casualty, and D and Pasco. Anna's first novel, The Safe Place, was inspired by her experiences working as a live-in housekeeper on a remote French estate, which for those who have read The Safe Place, I'm told was a pleasant experience. But in fact, the setting was inspired by the remote estate where she worked. As you'd also know, The Safe Place has become an international bestseller, and The Shadow House, which you'll see in front of you, is Anna's second book. Welcome to you, Anna.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here.
Born in Scotland, Barry Maitland came to Australia to head up the School of Architecture at the University of Newcastle. So really, he's ours as well, too. The Marx Sisters, the first in his London-based Brock and Collar crime novels, was published in 1994, and 13 more have followed in that series. He's also written the Australian-based trilogy Crucifixion Creek, Ash Island and Slaughter Park, featuring Sydney homicide detective Harry Beltree. He won the Ned Kelly Award for Best Novel in 1996 and has been regularly shortlisted for the award ever since. The Russian Wife, which you'll also see in front of you, is his latest Brock and Collar novel. Welcome to you, Barry.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody.
Wendy James is the author of 8 novels, including The Mistake and The Golden Child, which was shortlisted for the Ned Kelly Award for Best Novel. Her debut book, Out of the Silence, won the 2006 Ned Kelly Award for First Crime Novel and was shortlisted for the Dobby Award for Women's Writing. Wendy works as an editor at the Australian Institute of Health Innovation. Her novel, The Golden Child, is in development as a TV series. But today we're going to be talking about A Little Bird, which is Wendy's most recent book. So Barry, I'm going to start with you. Barry, The Russian Wife is the 14th book in your Brock and Collar series. Now, many in the audience will be familiar with David Brock. We've got a show of hands. Who knows about David Brock and Kathy Collar? but there will be some who aren't. So could you introduce them to us, please?
Yes, the reason why I started writing crime fiction was because in 1989 we were living in Newcastle, and Margaret, my wife there, was in a house in central Newcastle when the chimneys fell down and the house shook and the television flew across the room in the earthquake. And it was such a strange time after that. With so much sort of destruction, the army took over the center of the city, that I was looking for some sort of outlet, something different to take my mind off all this. And I thought, I've always wanted to write a crime novel. Now, I hadn't been in Australia at that time for very long, and I didn't have any contacts or insights about what the Australian situation was like. But I had a nephew and niece in London who were both with the Metropolitan Police, and she was also had access to the latest DNA information, which was just starting at that time. So I thought they would, they took me on the beat in London and gave me lots of information. But it seemed to me what was interesting about it was that the Metropolitan Police, like the police force here, I think, was very heavily male dominated at that time, but it was in a process of change and women were coming into more senior positions. And with my nephew and niece both together in the force, I thought I might have a couple, a male and a female, Brock, who's old, established detective chief inspector, very experienced, and Kathy Kohler, just starting out as a detective in homicide. And so the relationship between them is equal. It's not like Morse and Lewis, and Morse talks to Lewis, he says, not now, Lewis, it's a sort of servant-lord relationship almost. I wanted them to be equal, but at the same time, their experience is different. And so I wrote that story and finally got it published in 1994. And the publishers said they would like, they liked the characters and they would like a couple more maybe. And so I started out on a journey that I hadn't anticipated. And really those 14 books have been their journey through aging in Scotland Yard. I mean, one of the problems we can talk about, if you like, if you have serial characters, what do you do about aging? Do you do like Sherlock Holmes, who for 40 years stays the same age, or do you age them? And of course, if you're writing crime now, the times are changing so rapidly. Technology is changing, the whole processes, the legal system's changing, so they have to change too. So for me, it's been a sort of life's journey, which has been finally got to this point. But I have tried to make a more realistic aging, particularly of Brock, and of Kathy, who has now reached Detective Chief Inspector herself. She has her own, Scotland Yard has 24 murder investigation teams, and she heads one of these teams. So she's at the top level in terms of homicide. And in this book, Brock is sidelined. He's still a detective chief inspector, but the relationship between them is different now.
I'm hoping you might start us off with a quick reading as well, Barry, from the front of the book.
Okay, well, this is how the book starts. It's like finding yourself dropped on another planet. Brock was out of sorts, uncharacteristically grumpy, Kathy thought. Can you hear this all right? Is it okay? Yeah. They were 3 old colleagues, all of them detective chief inspectors in the Met. David Brock, Bren Gurney, and herself, Kathy Kohler, veterans of Brock's former homicide squad. Though they now worked in different Scotland Yard departments, they tried to lunch together at least once a month, if their schedules allowed, which was why they were now sitting in the 2 Chairmen pub in Westminster on a Monday in November, eating pot pies. They don't interview suspects, Brock continued. They never see them. They just sit at their screens all day, following money trails around the globe. I asked one of them, but where are they? Where are the crooks? And he just pointed out the window at the towers of the city and Canary Wharf, then turned back to his computer. Bren laughed. But Kathy could see that Brock was genuinely disconcerted. His hair and beard, silvery white now and cropped short, looked a bit shaggy and neglected. A big, steady figure in her life, it was unsettling to see him like this. After the debacle of his arrest during the Hampstead murders, the Met had reluctantly agreed to let him come back from retirement and take up his old rank, but not in homicide. There were no vacancies in the 24 murder investigation teams, they told him, and posted him to fraud, where he was clearly a fish out of water. It made Kathy feel sad, especially because the Hampstead murders had been the making of her in her new role as head of one of those teams. Since then, she'd had a series of successes, all cleared up in rapid time. Her team was working well, and she had been featured in an article in one of the Sunday supplements about the new breed of women detectives in the Metropolitan Police. Even her boss, Commander Torrens, head of Homicide and Serious Crime Command, had given her a rare pat on the back, expressing his satisfaction with her performance since she'd stepped out of the shadow of the old guard. He'd meant Brock, of course, for whom she'd worked all those years, and her pleasure at the compliment was tinged with regret as she saw him struggling now. What's so embarrassing is I'm about 50 years older and outrank them all, Brock was saying. I'm sitting there like a useless appendage, a waste of space with nothing to contribute. Bren, trying to be supportive, said, but they must be able to use your experience, Brock. Remember that bloke with the Ponzi scheme who started to murder his victims? What was his name? There must be villains like that in the city. No, Bren, fraud is abstract, digital, and bloodless. You've no idea. It's another world. He sighed, then roused himself. Anyway, enough of that. What about you, Kathy? What have you been up to? Well, I've got a locked room mystery. Ah, that's more like it. Go on. So she told them the story of Ahmed Majid.
Thanks so much, Barry. The interesting thing is that's the 14th book in a series, but because of that, those opening pages, it can be standalone. So whilst it flows beautifully and it seems like a very easy story, I imagine there's a whole lot of working to get it to the stage where the reader can pick it up, not knowing Brock or Collar. Is that right? Yes, I mean, that's one of the problems of writing a series. I get fed up with describing, the fact that, Kathy's got pale blonde hair. I mean, I said it the first few books and then I stopped saying it. And then I got readers complaining that they didn't know what color her hair was. So somehow you've got to sort of bring them into the story and then gradually bring them up to date, sort of thing. Yeah. Very deftly done. Thank you. Anna, in the Shadow House, we open with young mum Alex, who's in the car with her 2 kids. I must say, I really felt a lot for that scene, the squabbling kids, 1 teenager, 1 baby. Before I get you to read from that scene, can you tell me a bit about Alex and what has brought her to where she is?
Yeah, so Alex, when you see her in the first scene, she's driving her car into this new home, this new town. It's actually an eco-village. And in the back, she has her 7-month-old baby. And in the passenger seat beside her, she has her 14-year-old son, Ollie. And you very quickly find out that she's fleeing from an abusive relationship, but she's basically kind of had to wait till he's gone out to work. This isn't in the book, this is how I imagine it. She's waited till he's gone out to work and then she's just grabbed whatever she can, chucked it in the Kmart flexi tubs and the storage boxes, and she's just got the hell out. And she has had this plan of going to this eco village, which is kind of an hour north of Sydney and very tucked away, and kind of exactly what she needs at this time in her life.
And just before I ask Anna to read, I've listened to this book by audiobook, which I do frequently, and Anna, having been an actor, also does the audiobook. So when you hear her read, you're also getting an insight into the print book, but also the audiobook. Over to you, Anna.
I just want to say I listened to it too, and it's really, it's terrific. But also what Anna does really well is an Australian accent. It's fabulous. Yeah.
Which I kind of decided I wasn't going to do today because I feel self-conscious enough anyway without a bunch of Aussies staring at me, and I'm just not going to try and approximate the accent today.
But you can do it, can't you?
I can do it, hopefully. Yeah, Wendy says I can, so. All right. Okay, kids, I brought the car to a stop and peered out the windscreen. I think this is it. We're here. Neither child replied. Gazing at each of their sleeping faces in turn, Ollie beside me in the front, Cara in the back, I felt a pang of anticlimax. The first time I'd seen Pine Ridge, it had taken my breath away, and I'd been looking forward to seeing their expressions as we drove in. Well, Ollie's expression anyway. At 8 months old, Cara couldn't yet tell animal from vegetable, so I wasn't likely to get a reaction from her, but I'd been certain my 14-year-old son would be impressed. Instead, he was snoring. Headphones on, head lolling awkwardly to one side, drool glistening in the corner of his mouth. Kids, I said again, a little louder. As if in response, Ollie's phone lit up in his lap, buzzing softly with a notification. I glared at it, tempted to pick it up and hurl it straight into the nearest bin. Instead, I checked the house number and street name again. Definitely the right address, and the description matched. A split level at the far end of the village, the last in a row of 4. White walls, blue roof, 2 balconies, and a timber staircase at the side. No one was waiting to greet us though, which seemed strange until I remembered that I hadn't given an arrival time when I'd emailed a few days earlier. I'd had no idea when or even if we'd be able to get away, so I told them I'd have to play it by ear. No problem, had been the cheerful reply. Just pop into the office when you get here and we'll show you around. But the office had been empty when I'd passed, so I carried on driving along the narrow main road to our allocated unit, following the directions I'd been given. There was no rush. Eventually, either someone would find us or we would find them. I took a breath. The car was cramped and had that family road trip smell, feet and Happy Meals. Our belongings were packed around us so tightly I'd half expected the windows to burst. Storage cartons, loose shoes and books, jumbo flexi tubs bought in a hurry from Kmart and stuffed with our dirty laundry. I'd crammed them Tetris style into every inch of available space. An expert job if I did so myself. But if there was anything I did well, it was packing up and moving on. I rolled my window down and a fresh breeze pushed its way into the car, mussing my hair like a drunk uncle and bringing with it the sweet, earthy scent of resin. A tingle of excitement skipped across my skin. I live here now. I looked over at Ollie again, ducking my head a little to see under the peak of his cap. It was one of those gorgeous Australian November days, not too hot or sticky, just perfectly pleasant. But my son was bundled up in his usual sloppy green hoodie. It needed a wash. The orange circle on the front bore a tomato sauce stain the size of a 50-cent piece. "What's wrong with you?" he said, suddenly opening one eye. "Why do you keep staring at me?" "Oh, sorry, you're awake." "What?" My son held one of his headphones away from his ear and tinny music escaped from the padded speakers, a thrum of bass overlaid by a single screeching note like an air raid siren. I said, "You're awake." Obviously." He pushed his cap back and tugged his headphones down around his neck. "Why are we stopped?" "Because we're here. We've arrived."
We've arrived. Where exactly have they arrived? If I were to drive there now, what would I see in terms of the grand plan?
All right, so in the book, in the front of the book, there is a map, which I drew, by the way, on the front cover. It's not credited to me, which I'm frankly a little annoyed about, but I did draw it. So it's kind of based on a real eco-village that I spent some time at, but it's also a fictional amalgamation of a lot of different eco-villages that, that I found through my research. And what they tend to be in kind of rural surrounds, but they're not often completely off grid. You know, the one that I spent time at was quite close to Gosford train station, Gosford Hospital. So it was kind of edge of the suburbs. But when you drive in, you're struck by, you know, the sense of isolation. It feels like you're really tucked away in this, and Pine Ridge, the fictional eco-village, is in kind of a bowl. It's like in a valley. And so you drive around the ridge, and then the road kind of winds down into the valley. And when you get to the bottom, there's a dam right at the bottom, and all the houses are kind of built around the shore of one side of the dam. So if you were to stand among the houses looking over the dam, what you actually see across the valley is what the land used to be, which is farmland. And what's very important to the storyline is that there is a single building on the other side. There's kind of paddocks, and there's this single building, which is the farmhouse that belonged to the farmers who owned the land on which the eco-village was built, if that makes sense.
And of course, almost immediately we want to know what's inside, what's happened, what is this house all about? Thank you, Anna. Wendy, in A Little Bird, we meet journalist Jo Sharp, who's come back to the small town where she grew up. Can you tell me a bit about Jo and her family?
So Jo grew up in the small country town and left as fast as she could as soon as she left school. And her story, and the reason she wanted to get away, was her mother and baby sister, infant sister, disappeared about 20 years before the story starts, when she was only 8. And so her life has been changed immeasurably by that. She's never heard from again, doesn't know why she went, doesn't know where she went. It was a police case for a little while, and then a letter arrived saying, "I've gone, don't look for me," basically. And so she's grown up being brought up by her father, who has been very angry and become an alcoholic. And she's come back to the town because she's lost her job in Sydney. She's a journalist for a newspaper there, lost that job, and has found out too that her father, though he hasn't told her, has a cancer. So she's come up both to look after her father, and she gets a job at the town paper, which is not an ordinary paper, because the real paper has gone, as so many country newspapers have. Instead, there's a newspaper run by somebody's donated money to run this newspaper, but all it's allowed to be is good news. So they're not allowed to talk about the crimes that happen in this small town, which has become a very difficult town, where a lot of people have left, a lot of people are poor, there's a lot of drugs and alcohol, and, you know, it's a sad town. But she's not allowed to write about any of that. She's only allowed to write about all the fun things that happen, like grandparents' day at the school, and cricket matches, and dances, and a Stedfords, and the agricultural show, and things like that. So yeah, she's come back with her tail between her legs, basically, wondering what the hell she's doing.
And I'd like you to show us how you open the book in the prologue. It's a great prologue.
Arthurville, 1994. My mother took, I have to take my glasses off. I can't read with my glasses on. My mother took the Mini, a 74 model with squeaky brakes, balding tyres, and 120,000 miles on the odometer. A good car, a 15-year-old Falcon station wagon, was out of action. The lights had been left on overnight, the battery was dead, and there was no spare cash to replace it. Dad was on an out-of-town shift and didn't like to leave Mum without a car, so he'd cycled to the station on his dodgy old bike. I left for school just before 8:30. I was running late. I was always running late, and was glad to escape the noise and the mess and my mother's irritability. Amy was crying. Amy was always crying. She needed feeding. She always needed feeding. And my mother's goodbye had been perfunctory, as her interactions always were since Amy had arrived. A distracted wave. See you later. Have a nice day. According to the initial police report, Bev Ryan, who lived across the road, was walking into town for a cut and colour at 9:30 and had passed by just in time to see Mum close the front door, carry the car seat to the rear of the little pale blue car and clip it in. Bev had said hello, peered at the sleeping baby through the window. What a sweet little thing, all that gorgeous hair, and walked on. Lionel Perkins, who had the garage on the corner, had seen her drive past not long after. He'd admired her profile. She was still a looker despite the 2 kids, as well as her smooth gear change. You could always tell a farm girl. She'd waved to Val Darrow, who was sweeping the pavement outside Martin's news agency. Val had seen the greeting, but ignored it for reasons even she couldn't fathom. Ray Yee, stacking apples out in the front of Yee's old fruit shop, had seen her turn left onto the main road heading towards the highway. He'd waved, but too late for her to wave back. She'd stopped at the BP on the outskirts of town where Mervyn Ebsworth filled the tank for her. He'd offered to check the oil, the tyres, but she'd already checked them herself. Mervyn, a shy man, especially when it came to women, hadn't said much, but he'd noticed the baby still rosily asleep in her capsule and told her that he and his wife had just had their 4th, about the same age, a boy, Timothy. She'd asked him to pass on her regards to Shirley. She'd passed Errol Simmons and his wife Wendy on the highway. They were coming in from Haringey to take Wendy's mother to the hospital. It was the 4th emergency trip they'd made in the last 2 months. The other 3 had turned out to be indigestion, but better safe than sorry. Errol recognised the Mini immediately. He'd sold it to my father 5 years before for a bit too much. It had been his kid's runaround, was well past its use-by date, and had always felt vaguely guilty about it. Phil Coombs, local stock and station agent, had been heading to town on the back road from Dalhunty. He'd seen Mum waiting at the intersection when he'd turned back onto the highway. He'd flashed his lights and grinned. He'd known her since they were kids, had worked as a jackaroo for her old man, but she hadn't returned his smile, just lifted 2 fingers off the steering wheel in acknowledgement. He'd watched in his rearview mirror as she put the little car into gear and turned left onto Oxley Road. She was heading east, following the path of the river back towards its source. How was Phil to know that he would be the last person to see her that day? That he would be the last person to see her at all before she became a headline? There'd been no signs, no portents, or none that any of us had seen, at least. Not even me, not even in retrospect.
Thanks very much, Wendy. A little bit like Barry's book, that prologue's very important because we're dealing with a small town. It's difficult to work out, to introduce the field of characters to your readers and then to move on. So within that prologue, what I liked was that we get an introduction to where we are and to the mystery. Was it a difficult piece to write, and did you write it at the beginning or at the end of the book?
I wrote it first, but interestingly enough, I had a section that was in there that's why I actually forgot I had the prologue until you asked me to read it, because I split it in 2, and now the second part of that is now in the middle of the book. So yeah. So it was written first, but is also somewhere else.
It's a great hook at the start of the book.
Yeah, because it sort of sets up the scene, but also the mystery. And so we have that question that propels us further.
I think it's really cool as well at hearing it after you've read it, because there's so many things in there that are important and that, you know, they're threads that you tie up later. And it's very cool to hear that. Yeah.
It's also, it's the town in the 90s. So the idea was too that you got a sense of the town before it became as difficult as it is now. So that's a town that's more lively, where people are doing things, you know, people are sweeping the street, and there's what I liked about it, just rereading it, was, you know, there was a fruit shop. There's, you know, in 2018, there's no longer a fruit shop. There's no news agent, or, you know, all of that stuff is gone. So yeah.
So Wendy, the topic, what lies below the surface, is a very broad one, particularly when we're talking about mystery and crime. But my question for you is, what's the lure of the protagonist returning to the small town where he or she has grown up? Why is that such a device that is of interest to many writers, including yourself?
Oh, I don't know, maybe it's age. Well, specifically, I think it was a bit of a lockdown book, to be honest, and it is a lure in general, but I think I wrote this when we were all in lockdown and children were separated from families and we weren't able to get out west to see our family, and I did think a lot about, you know, what it means to leave a place and then to never go back, which is what we did. You know, my husband and I left a small town like that and went to the city and never went back, and I wanted my 30-year-old to come back. So I wrote a novel about a 30-year-old coming back. Yeah.
But it's also a really interesting variation on the classic, you know, murder mystery type of story, which has two timelines in it. You know, the event happens, the detectives come along, and there's the story of how they proceed and what they're guessing and what they're trying to find out and so on. And that moves forward in time. But at the same time, to understand what happened then, they've got to move back in time. They've got to look at what happened an hour before, the day before, a month. And it may well be a whole generation before that's key to the murder. So you've got these two timelines, and you've brought them together in a very interesting way.
I actually started this novel wanting not to do that. So I've never written a novel from a singular standpoint where it just happens in one time. And I thought this time that I would. And then Mary appeared, the second character from the past. And yeah, exactly what you were just saying happened. I couldn't sort out the present crime without going, I couldn't write about what was happening in the present without bringing somebody in from the past. And yeah, which I really admire. So your two books where you do have things that happened in the past, but the action happens in the present. And that's what I was determined to do, and I couldn't.
And Barry, not only does the action happen in the present, but it happens in a completely different world to the world that Wendy and indeed Anna described. It's the world of art. Can you tell me about the place of art in the Russian Wife?
I've always been loved art, and I've been fascinated by it. I'm not sure. I think it might have been that Leonardo portrait, the savior of the world. Some guys found it in America, I think, and paid about $1,100 for it, and then managed to persuade these top experts that it is actually a Leonardo. And until then, it had been written off as one of his apprentices who'd done it. And by the time they'd finished, they'd ramped it up that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia paid almost $500 million American dollars for this painting. And the top end of the art market is so crazy. And of course, where there's big money like that, there's crime and forgery. One expert has said that Picasso, during his lifetime, drew 24,000 artworks, of which 60,000 are in the United States. And so I thought, there'd be a wonderful subject for fraud. You see, it would get Brock away from the screens and out into the real world again. Also, it would mean, because it's international forgery and fraud, it would mean that he could go to some interesting places, which for the last couple of years we haven't been able to go to. So he goes to Miami, for instance, where there's an annual art fair which brings together all the aspiring artists and dealers around the world. I have been to one of those, and I thought it was a crazy thing. And then he goes to New York as well, and then he comes back to London. So there's more travel than he usually does in his books. It's not just confined to London.
As well as being an architect, you also paint.
Yeah.
Do you think the eye that you need as an architect and also a painter pervades your writing at all?
Well, in the sense that I think both architecture, for me, both architecture and painting are about place. Buildings are different from motor cars because they're locked in one place, and they have to respond to that place. And similarly, landscape painting, which is what I was most interested in, is very much an expression of place. And in terms of how I write crime fiction, I always begin with the place. Until I can imagine the place, the setting for the story, I can't imagine the characters and what's going to happen. So usually when the publishers asked for some more with these two characters, I thought, well, how do you do that? And I thought, well, London, like any big city, is a series of villages or small places, and with their own individual characters and different types of people who are living there, so that in each book I can just go to a different part of London, look at its history, look at the kind of people who've settled there, the migrants who've come to that place. And so, the characters grow out of the place, and then the crimes grow out of the characters. What kind of murder would they commit? So the place is very much part of the book. Yeah.
Thank you. Anna, I would almost say the opposite for you, I think, from previous conversations we've had, that you've trained as an actor, and correct me if I'm wrong, but an actor is all about character. Is that where your work starts?
Yeah, it is. I would say definitely for me, story begins and ends with character. But what you said, Barry, really resonates, because until you can visually, well, for me, until I can visually picture the place, right, I can't see or feel or hear what my characters are going to be doing, how they're going to be doing it, how they're going to be interacting with other people. So place is really important. And I think that setting and place really informs who the characters are as well. How they're going to be interacting with their environment is just as important as what's going on internally.
And yet, is it true that an early draft of the book wasn't set in the eco village? And did that change when you found the eco village? Did that change the way the characters interacted?
Oh, it just changed it so much. Yeah. For anyone who doesn't know, and I've talked about this a fair bit on different things that I've done, because it was a really harrowing experience. I wrote a first draft of this novel that just did not work at all. And I was very keen, I'd only written one novel before, and I'd done that on my own terms, my own time. And so I kind of thought that's what you do for the second one. And I'd also heard a lot of writers saying, write the first draft with the door closed. It's for you. Once you've got your second draft underway, then you can open the doors up and let people in. So I was like, okay, have the door closed. Don't show anybody. Got to do it myself. And it was like 90,000 words of something that just didn't work at all, because I hadn't checked. I just hadn't bounced ideas around. I'd just done it all in here and it didn't work. Anyway, so that draft, I had one timeline, one POV in Bristol, UK, one here in Sydney, and then the two of them were going to meet up in Guatemala. So yeah, I know, right? It's really funny because it was never going to work, I don't think. Specifically, not with the story that I had in mind anyway. And it was my publisher here in Australia said to me, one of the reasons why this draft doesn't work is because, your story is not anchored to any one place. It feels very untethered. It's floating around all over the place. You've got nothing that's really anchoring the characters and the story together. So in that first failed draft, I had a character whose dream it was to build an eco-village, and that was all part of a sort of a subplot about a particular community of people that lived a certain way. So I thought, right, well, how can I make that place a reality? Okay, let's research eco-villages. Maybe there's something in that. And I discovered there was actually an eco-village about 20 minutes down the road from me. On that day when I found out that that place was real, it was, I think the next day they were having an open day because they were a demonstration eco-village. So I booked my place on it. And as I drove through the gates on that open day, I was like, yes, this is it. And then all of a sudden, this new story came to life. I could see my characters walking around. I could see what they were doing. And also that eco-village that is near my house, it had been built over a horticultural research station. So dotted amongst all these beautiful, gleaming new eco houses, which, it's not all like hobbit houses and stuff. They're really gorgeous kind of architectural wonders. But in amongst all of this newness is all these old sheds, laboratories, like abandoned greenhouses with the kind of, the plastic sheeting flapping in the wind. And it was so interesting to me. And I said to the woman guiding us around, I said, what are all these things? What are all these places? And she said, oh yeah, it's a horticultural research station. And when we arrived, it was a bit weird because there were all these labs everywhere. And we were like, well, what happened here once? And I just went, I've got it. I've got the story. And that's all. I don't need to be here anymore. I'm going to go.
Wendy, what most impressed me, well, many things impressed me about A Little Bird, but what I was particularly drawn to was the way that you told the story almost like a collage. So you use newspaper articles and you use different medium. So blogs, websites, and that's something that is not new to you in The Golden Child, and I think your other work. You mix mediums in order to tell the story. Could you tell me a bit more about that?
I have a terrible, messy writing process. So I might write the last chapter first or part of a middle of the book chapter. And it's interesting that you use the word collage, because basically that's what I end up doing. And I keep writing and writing and hoping that all of these kind of disparate things will eventually add up into a story that fits together. And somehow it does. It's kind of like magic, but it is, yeah, I do use a kind of collage system to write it. So yeah, and I think our stories all, when you think about your own life story, it always involves so many bits and pieces of other people's life stories and the past and the people you're with and your friends and the things that you read. And I think every novel I've done has had elements of that, because it always strikes me that your story can come from lots of directions as I'm writing, and not just, especially if you're writing a first person narrative. Sometimes it's good to get away from that too and bring in another perspective.
So a question for everybody. As social media becomes more prevalent, does the way that you want to tell stories change in terms of using blogs, using websites, or do you want to try and ignore it all? Barry, what do you think?
I'm the last person to answer. I think I haven't been able to keep up, I'm afraid.
I think you have. I mean, that's why I asked you, because I think with David Brock and the Russian wife, he is grappling with a new world, not only a new part of the police, but new ways to get information. And obviously, when you're aging your protagonists, they age with technology. So was that an interesting field to explore?
Yeah, I can understand the aging. It's a matter of keeping him alive, really. I should say that that's only half the book, because Kathy also has a story which is completely different. It's not about art forgery, and so she has to be alive in a different sort of way. She has to be much more sort of vigorous or active physically in her story. Her story is about what they call noble cause corruption, where a police officer knows that somebody's guilty, but can't get the evidence to prove it, knows that they'll act again and innocent people will be hurt, and takes the law into their own hands in order to prevent that from happening. So they do the wrong thing for the right reason. And she's faced with a case like that. And when she gets involved in it, it becomes very, very dangerous for her, and she then is at risk. So that's a separate story, and in a way, a bit like you're talking about a collage. I was collaging these two stories together, and I found that a really interesting thing, because with most of the Brock and Kohler stories, they're on the same case, and they're just both working it in different ways. But in this case, there's a sort of juxtaposition, a moving between the two stories, which I enjoy doing. Yeah.
And I think, Anna, that probably strikes a chord with you as well, because you also have a dual narrative, but a clear dual narrative in terms of point of view and chapter headings. Yeah. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I think it's a really, really interesting thing to talk about, whether or not, the advancement of technology changes the way we want to tell stories. I don't think, for me, it doesn't change the way I want to tell stories, as in using mixed media and things like that. But it does change, I think, the way that we consume stories. Our attention spans are shorter, for example. We do want faster narratives. And so I'm quite aware of that I think if you're writing in the crime thriller genre, you are competing with streaming services and Netflix, and the ways that people are, you're competing with people who flick on their Instagram, they go, bum, 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 I've just consumed 3 different tiny mini narratives. And now I'm kind of fulfilled for the next 5 minutes, and then I'll go back and I'll look at another few mini narratives. And so it's quite, I am quite aware that our brains are needing things to move a bit quicker. My story, The Shadow House, is largely about parental fear in an age of technology. And so one of the things that I wanted to explore in this is my fear as a parent. My kids are 5 and 7. And I am my mind is a bit blown by technology these days. My son has got a Nintendo. I don't know how to plug it into the screen to make it work, and he's endlessly frustrated with me. And I had a conversation with a friend who was she was a single mother raising a 14-year-old, and she was kind of being very emotionally open about how difficult it is. And I think that parents of, my/our generation who grew up without the internet, it's a really hard world to navigate, and we're trying to advise and guide our children in a world that we don't fully understand, we're not fully engaged with. It's like our children are living on a different planet, and we're on this other planet going, you just have to do this, you got to go over there, you'll be fine, go and, we don't know. And they actually kind of speak a different language as well in some ways. And so I think it's definitely something that we're all exploring. I really want to explore it. I think that fear of technology, fear of the internet, fear of how that affects us, particularly with regards to our children, is just fascinating at the moment.
And Wendy, that's something really that you've looked at previously. And for me, I would say The Golden Child, that was really one of your interests. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I had children. I've got older children who are in their late 20s, 30s, and then we had some 10 years later. And so when I wrote The Golden Child, that was 5 years ago, I guess now, we had a teenage daughter coming up. And yeah, so that novel was really about how, as Anna said, how crazy you feel with kids who are just doing things that you've got no idea about, and what do you do about it, and what dangers there are out there for them, because yeah, there are plenty, and also what evil children can do with this technology. That's what The Golden Child was also about. Yeah.
But also how, because in The Shadow House, that there are a lot of parents who are terrified of those things, and they're constantly pointing out how much evil there is out there, how much awful stuff is on the internet, how accessible it is, it's terrible. But there are also these kids who are not scared of it, who are navigating it fine because they speak that language, and it's actually oftentimes our fear of it that is more harmful.
Well, we found it quite useful, for instance, when our daughter at about 15 decided to disappear for a night, to say, I'm going to stay at a friend's, and we knew the friend and rang the friend because I needed an internet code. So I rang up the friend's father, who said, no, we haven't seen Nell. And we had to backtrack all of her whereabouts for that day. But we used Facebook, of course, to do that. Our son, the younger son, went and contacted all her friends on Facebook so that we could work out where she'd gone and sort of reverse engineered. Did discover where she was, but she was out of radio range. So we couldn't get her back till the next day, by which time she'd had 3,000 messages. And so, yeah, there are benefits, and yeah. Yeah.
I've just noticed the time, and I'm mindful that there are going to be questions in the audience and perhaps also on Zoom. So this is your chance to ask questions of Barry and Wendy and Anna. Are there any questions to start us off?
I think you were trying to get to, where did you first set it? Guatemala? Is that where you were trying to get
to Guatemala, so set it on the Central Coast. No.
I'm just going to repeat the question for the Zoom people. So the question is from Petronella McGovern, who's also an author here, and is about the research. How did you research your work during the lockdown?
Well, I sort of based it on a town I grew up in, but what I'd also done over the years, and perhaps everyone's done this, is Googling family on Trove and finding part of the novel is about a gossip column. So I did a lot of looking at gossip columns in country town newspapers. That was my main research, and I loved doing that and finding just bizarre things, which is what gave me the idea, you know, like my father's family lived in Burke in the 50s, and there'd be things like, Mr. and Mrs. James have gone to Sydney for the weekend with their sons Anthony and Perry. We hope they have a lovely time. And that's in the newspaper. So that's what I kind of filled this up with. So yeah, that was lovely research, actually.
Barry, what sort of research most interested you in this last book?
Well, yes, unfortunately, I wasn't able to go to the places that Brock went to, but I mean, it's so wonderful now what you can find on the web. I mean, you know, in New York, I couldn't remember, you know, how you move about Penn Station, you know, so, you know, you just look it up and work it out, you know, how you go 2 floors down to buy the ticket, and it sort of comes back to you. So I rely on that very, very heavily. But apart from that, it was more memories of places that I've been to that I've used.
You, Anna?
Well, I mean, as Petronella said, I could actually go to the places because they were local to me. So that was a huge help, particularly because I was on a deadline. So I was like, I don't have time to imagine these things. I've got to go find them. But interestingly, I'm just started work on a new book, which will largely be about travel and itinerants and van life and life on the road. And for several reasons, I'm looking at setting it in WA. I've never been to WA. I've never lived in a van. So it's like I'm aware that I'm setting myself a real challenge in this climate because I cannot get to those places, and I know for a fact that it's heaps more helpful to me if I can see and feel and touch and, you know, smell these places. But as Barry said, you know, it's amazing what you can find. You can literally go on like Google Earth and drive the route. You can drive it. You know, the blogs, there are countless YouTube blogs. You can YouTube anything and there'll be someone with a camera showing you and telling you what it is. It's actually much easier than I thought. I probably will have to get over there at some point if I do set it there. Fingers crossed.
Just a little tip. Maybe Western Australia is not your greatest bet at the moment.
I know, a bit unwise. Maybe it'll be set on the Central Coast again.
I think there is a risk in this, though, that, you know, you become so infatuated with your research that you want to tell the reader everything you've discovered, you know, and you really have to prune hard, you know, to remember that the important thing is the story.
And also readers read things into the book that might not be there. When my last book, The Accusation, I set somewhere similar to here, sort of out west, but then I had to change it, and I was doing a tour, and we were in Cessnock, I think, and somebody said, "Oh, you set it here, didn't you?" I was saying, "I've never been here before, but yes." so everywhere I went, it was set there.
Oh, well, you capture the spirit of lots of places.
We've got a second question up the back, please. If you tell me the question, then I'll say it. So it's a question about a point of view used in your books. How did you choose it, and does it change? Can I start with Wendy?
I've got a first person and a third person perspective in this, and I do that a lot. And sometimes I'll write something and I'll just really like the narrative perspective that I've started in. And other times I'll change. I'll start in first person, not like it, see if it works in third, change back. Sometimes I'll try second person. And it's just the one that clicks. Eventually a voice works.
Sorry.
Yeah, I was interested actually thinking about, have you all used first person at in one of your books, I think? And I was really interested in that because it is a very intimate form of narrative. It means that the character is talking directly to the reader. I've only used it once in a book I wrote about Lord Howe Island, and it's one of my favorite books, actually. I enjoyed writing in that way, but of course the Brock and Kohler ones, I'm stuck with third person, yeah, which is a more remote, I think, yeah.
Yeah, mine was a really deliberate decision. much like Wendy, I have a POV in the past and a POV in the present. So it made sense for me to use third person for the past and first person in the present, but also the POV in the present, Alex. It's really important that the reader is in her head, because a lot of what goes on with Alex is about her not being able to trust her own thoughts. And so for me, it was really important that I convey that intimacy. Which threw up its own challenges, I have to say, because with the safe place, it was all third person. I had 3 different, I wasn't actually, Nina was first person. But with this, I found it really difficult, actually, because I think, you know, description becomes a bit of a problem, because everything has to be filtered through the first person gaze. It has to be, everything that you write has to be true to that character. You can't be a kind of omniscient narrator hovering above, and you can't deliver this beautiful prose that describes a building if that's not what your character would say. So that becomes a bit of a problem. And I actually found first person quite uncomfortable, which I was surprised at. You know, being an actor, I thought, oh, this will be a breeze, but it wasn't. It was quite hard.
We've got a question on Zoom. This is coming from Judith, and it's a question for you, Barry. Barry, do you have any specific thoughts about what lies below the surface in the mind and actions of the perpetrators? Big question.
Gosh, yes. Yes, it's a question about how you gradually reveal that, how through the imagination of the detectives, the inner mind of the perpetrator has to be gradually exposed, or they're being forced into a situation where they suddenly have to reveal themselves, which is what happens with Kathy, where she thinks she's having a useful dialogue with the perpetrator, and then suddenly discovers that the perpetrator is turning the tables on her. So you can exploit then that insidious sort of unknown level that's going on.
It's a difficult thing to discuss in a forum like this, where people haven't necessarily read the books, because what lies below the surface is exactly what the reader wants to find out. Yes. Is that always the way, Wendy? Is there always something in everything you write that lies below the surface that isn't immediately apparent?
Yes, I hope so. Every now and then you get a reviewer who says, oh, I guessed it in the first 5 pages, but generally you have to read on. Yes. There's something hidden, or there's not much point in keeping on going. And sometimes if it's hidden from you, that's what sometimes is really good, when you're writing it and you think you know, and then it turns and changes, and what you think was going to happen isn't what happened. Yes. Yeah.
You're saying yes, Barry. Is that something that happens for you, in terms of when you write, you don't necessarily know what might come?
Yes, I do try to, I do the research and try to plan out what I'm going to do, but at a certain point my head's full and I just have to start writing. And then I may well discover that actually what I thought was going to happen isn't going to happen. It's too obvious. It doesn't satisfy. And then you're in real trouble. But I have great faith in, there was a French mathematician called Poincaré who'd come up with the most amazing things, but nobody could understand how he did it, and he couldn't understand how he did it either. And he believed that, you get to a certain point, you've worked and worked and worked, and then just forget it, just put it away. And your mind will go on working even though you don't know that it's working. This is what he believed. And there are many stories about him. He'd be getting onto a tram with a friend, and they're in the middle of a conversation, and as his foot lands on the floor of the tram, he suddenly comes out with the answer to the formula, for some extraordinary formula that nobody's been able to find, a proof or something. And it's something that he stopped working on, several months before. And his mind just came out with it. And he thinks we have this capacity if we just let it, if we just trust it, which I find rather comforting, actually, as an author.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. So trust and have comfort. Thank you so much to my guests, Barry and Wendy and Anna. And they'll all be in the bookshop signing their books. So please do come and say hi before the last session of the day for BAD. And I'd also like to thank Kata and Luca for their technological support. And of course, to our audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne.